Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, National Retrospective, where we chronicle the career of one of indie rock's most prominent names and one of our favorite indie rock bands, The National, of course. Last time, we were joined by our friend Hannah to talk about one of the biggest moments for this band, their album, High Violet. And now we are bringing back another guest from a previous episode of the podcast to talk about Trouble Will Find Me. One of their, I think, is this one of their most commercially successful records?
Yeah, so it's a good way of kind of starting into it as well, because as we talked about with High Violet, right, so that was kind of a cultural saturation moment. That was kind of the crowning moment, I guess, for the National in terms of being ascending to the kind of realm of sort of indie rock greats, essentially. Like Boxer was definitely a record where critically they were sort of inducted into that realm, basically. But here with High Violet, it was weird. They kind of confirmed their place at the table, essentially, and sort of like confirmed that they were still ascendant, essentially. And that was also kind of the beginning of their 2010s arc as well, because we kind of talked about how you can kind of cleave the Nationals' career essentially into the 4 2000s albums and the 4 2010s records, essentially. And in the wake of High Violet, which we kind of talked about, one of their loudest, one of their most aggressive, their most immediate, the question comes kind of, how do you follow that up? How do you build on that? And I think the place to begin when considering how Trouble Will Find Me kind of sounds in comparison to High Violet, but also kind of how it works as a follow-up, is to remember as well that one of the things about the recording of High Violet was that it was incredibly fractious, right? It took a long time to record that album. And, you know, it's one of those kind of Radiohead and Rainbow stories where it's like the band are almost tearing themselves apart, trying to get the songs right, trying to get the sequencing right, trying to get the album to be the way that they want it to be. And when you know that as well, it definitely sounds like a labored over album, especially with that intentional kind of noisy, messy aesthetic to the way that it's produced. And so the distinction with Trouble Will Find Me is the band were quite clear about kind of not wanting to go through that process again and wanting to try to record a record in a way that had a little bit less pressure, essentially, that was a little bit more free flowing, right? So they changed their location where they're recording. I believe they recorded in a recording studio that was a converted barn, like that would kind of be turned into like a kind of cabin in the woods sort of style thing. And they basically just kind of hold themselves up there for a while, essentially, in 2012. You can imagine it being a sort of like a kind of like bonding camp experience, you know what I mean? Like where they were just, the aim was to come up with a record, essentially, but that wasn't kind of what they were doing every second of every day, essentially. And so you had a lot of, at least from what I've read, you know, a lot of kind of quite sort of almost like cliche movie scenarios where they'd be kind of like sitting around a campfire, just kind of demoing acoustically and just kind of like letting the songs breathe, right? And this was, of course, another record like the last one where they self-produced. Bryce and Aaron did produce this themselves. And you can hear as well, both in the production stories and in the sound of this record, how much the band really wanted to kind of be a step in a different direction from High Violet, not necessarily changing up their sound in any dramatic way, but really kind of refining the core elements and stripping away a lot of the window dressing that kind of made High Violet what it is. This is an album where the songs are really bare. Like there's definitely layering and there's definitely like lots of different instrumentation, and the band have kind of called back a lot of their various collaborators from other records, you know, brass players, string players, all that sort of thing. But for the most part, the mixes of these songs are really spacious, and there's not a huge amount going on at once most of the time, right? And a lot of the songs are either led by piano or acoustic guitar, which is really, really interesting. And they're not dominated by massive progressions, swells, or climaxes like the songs on High Violet were. In fact, a lot of the songs on here just kind of meander and drift. There's and we can talk about the sequencing of this record, how the sequencing is really smart to kind of like take you through these various pushes and pulls that the album has, where you have a kind of a bit more of a surging moment followed by a little bit more of a kind of stately moment. And the record kind of moves through this progression in a way that feels like it's really kind of pulling you along and you're not exactly 100% sure where you're going to end up. It's a record that feels like, I mean, compared to some of their previous 2 records, which are just like so structurally tight, right? Every single, like you can't pull any of the threads out of the last two records, the whole record falls apart. Whereas this one, I mean, it's a longer record as well. I'm pretty sure this is their longest record up to this point in their career, nearly an hour long, basically. It's a record where if you're looking for a really sort of tight, cohesive, really kind of focused experience, you might be left a bit adrift by this album. But if you're looking for a record that you can kind of just sink into, collapse into almost, and sort of just forget where you are and lose track of time, not so much care where one song ends and another song begins, this is like a textbook example of one of those records done really, really well. Now, we have a guest with us, of course, Mika, who has been with us on the podcast before. It's been a while, though, so this has been a long time coming, the return. So, Mika, tell us, first of all, what's your relationship with the National? What does this band mean to you? At what point did you kind of come into contact with this record? Or was it the first one you heard? Or was it one that you heard when you were already deep into their discography? And what does the music mean to you?
So I got into the National, I believe, like 3 years ago. I had this like image in my head of them being this like suit and tie wearing band that might not really appeal to me, even though I love indie rock. And there were just a bunch of indie rock bands from the 2000s that I just kind of missed out on getting into. I was a big fan of the Strokes and Arctic Monkeys in high school, but Yeah Yeah Yeahs and the National, they just kind of like passed by me. But someone said something about Mr. November a few years ago, and it just intrigued me. And so I went for a walk one day and I put Alligator on. And it didn't hit immediately, but I was like, okay, there's something here. And I love Mr. November. Like that song is fucking awesome. And then a couple months later, I heard Mr. November again, became obsessed with that. I go back to Alligator. Suddenly I'm getting lost in tracks like Baby Will Be Fine and Val Jester too, which also grew on me a lot over time. And I just started to love the way that Matt would use like this beautiful voice. His voice is gorgeous, but also just like to hear that voice saying the kind of strange things that he would say. I really like that kind of thing, just a weird contrast in music like that. And then so from Alligator, I heard Boxer, which was kind of a frustrating listen to me. That one took a while to grow on me. I just didn't get why that was like supposed to be a super special album out of their catalog. And then at some point I went back to Cherry Tree, and then High Violet. High Violet was the one that like cemented me as a fan, because that one, like you said, is so immediate. I remember I was doing DoorDash and I was driving around listening to that album for the first time and like tearing up when Vanderlyle Crybaby Geeks came on. That line, all the very best of us string ourselves up for love. That is one of the most beautiful lyrics that I've ever heard. That just touches me in my soul. It's like, I love when an artist like Adrian Linker does, where an artist can like make the listener on their shittiest day feel like they're a part of the human race or some shit. That's what he did there. And also, I think that track was like one of their most universal up to that point. And I think it makes for a nice transition to Trouble Will Find Me, because to me, that's part of the big appeal of that album, which was also a grower for me. But once it like started to hit really hard and pretty fast. When I'm thinking about what my favorite National record is, it's usually between Alligator and Trouble Will Find Me. And Alligator has that early like kind of anxiousness that Matt has, and then Trouble Will Find Me has that more of a maturity, like trying to decide which one is my favorite. Is like comparing two very different albums. So it's hard to pick. But another thing I think is part of the appeal of Trouble Will Find Me, and I don't know if this was intentional by the band or if this is something that other fans feel, but I get a kind of like oceanic vibe from a lot of the album. I feel like I'm kind of like standing on the beach, maybe in the evening, listening to it. And there's imagery that Matt uses throughout the album, mentioning the sea, mentioning swamps, often like comparing them to love, talking about sinking in Don't Swallow the Cap. And that's like one of my favorite vibes in music. I never really noticed it until today on that walk. That actually like deepened my love for it today.
I like that your two favorites are Alligator and Trouble Will Find Me. And I think you really highlighted like why that's like, there's a dichotomy there. Like it's like two completely inverse sides of the band almost. The Alligator is the kind of peak of that sort of early sort of really anxious energy where it kind of explodes because that, the band don't really know what to, or Matt doesn't really know what to do with that energy and kind of doesn't know how to deal with it. And the tension just rises. Whereas here it's like to me, the word I come back to when I think of this record is wistful. Like it's melancholy, like wistful melancholy. Like it's sad, but it's kind of like it's reflective in its sadness, as opposed to like it's, you know, tense in its sadness. Like, you know, there's moments on the record where, you know, for sure you can tell that the sentiments are coming from a place of pain, but there's never any kind of like there's a kind of resignedness to it. Like Matt kind of understands his pain, and also like, you know, there are songs in here that are about love and relationships as always, but I would say also there are more songs on here than maybe any record since Alligator that are specifically about drugs and drug abuse, so alcohol and otherwise as well, that Matt refers to, because obviously he's, you know, his persona, and he's kind of cultivated, you know, maybe somewhat intentionally, but also it's kind of maybe come to be something that's kind of like absurdly overshadows who he is as a figure. You know, he's this kind of wine drunk sort of dude who's just kind of like spilling his guts essentially, and has very little filter, you know, and it's kind of gonna maybe make the situation a little bit awkward at the function or whatever it is. And so that's the kind of the persona that he imbues, or that's something that he's come to be identified as. And like here to me is where like that kind of starts to be like a really heavy presence in the songs themselves. Like, I mean, for instance, like Matt has even confirmed outright that a song like This Is the Last Time is specifically about being addicted to prescription drugs, essentially. And all the lyrics in that song, like, but he obviously writes in a way where it's sort of like, you know, that kind of typical songwriterly thing where it's like, is it about drugs or is it about a woman? Who knows? It's about both. Yeah, but he's like been very upfront about the fact that, you know, a lot of this record is kind of focusing on his shortcomings, the sources of those shortcomings, and then how those shortcomings have affected his relationships. What I like about the record is that, you know, it's not just, you know, the relationships and the people within this album, the stories, you know, they're not just, you know, your typical standard, you know, oh, it's a broken relationship and my heart is aching and I fucked it up and all that sort of thing. But he also sort of talks about relationships that I think have a little bit more nuance than the sorts of relationships that get typically talked about in, you know, your bog standard rock songs. I Should Live in Salt, for instance, is a song that Matt wrote to his brother about feeling guilty about having, you know, not been there for him. And it's got a really interesting backstory as well, as big national heads will know. On the tour for High Violet, this is something I briefly mentioned in the last episode. Tom, Matt's brother, accompanied them because he's a filmmaker basically, and he wanted to do a film of their tour essentially. And what the film ended up being was, you know, half a tour document, but also half a document of this kind of fractious relationship between Matt and his brother, who are two very opposite personalities, right? Matt, this very kind of control freak, insular person, and Tom, this much more kind of freewheeling, you know, laissez-faire, you know, let's just do what feels good sort of person as well. And that led to some friction, which is documented in that documentary. And so I Should Live in Soul is a song that Matt wrote as a kind of way of apologizing and also kind of acknowledging his own shortcomings in terms of maybe being too hard on his brother and having, you know, in his own words, leaving him behind essentially. And that kind of emotional nuance, you know, it's not a new thing for Matt. He's a very emotionally nuanced writer, but there's almost like, you know, there's still abstraction and all that sort of stuff throughout the record, but I almost feel like you can see a little bit more of Matt as a person. It feels just a little bit more personal, this album to me, than maybe anything they've made up until this point. And I think maybe for Matt, that might come out of the fact that in the writing process, he said about the fact that, you know, this was some of the easiest lyrics for him to write were the lyrics on this album. Some of them just kind of like came out of him. Like it wasn't the sort of thing where it was heavily workshopped and heavily redrafted for months and months and months. Like apparently he wrote the lyrics to I Should Live in Salt like within hours of receiving the music from Aaron. So yeah, there's less of a filter here. There's less of a self-consciousness in the lyrics, like and trying to like make them as perfect as possible. You know, there's moments on this record where Matt, you know, kind of leans into some of his most kind of identifiable motifs of, you know, repetition, and kind of sometimes he just is happy to let a line kind of end on a dour note or kind of not quite feel conclusive or even quite right, but it has this effect that contributes to the wider feeling of the song. And so that's, I think, I imagine, now Trouble Will Find Me, to be fair, is not one of my absolute favorite national records like it is for you two, but that I think is the biggest appeal of the record to me, is that there's this sense where everything is less overthought, everything is less kind of precise, and it's just a record where whatever happens. And I think that contributes to the lack of tension and to the easiness of the listening experience, I think. Jake, I'm curious to hear what you think, as well as someone who holds this record near and dear to your heart.
Yeah, this was the second National album that I went and listened to like all the way through, just because it was one that I knew Morgan held in high esteem. And so I went to it, and I think that in retrospect, it was probably smart of me to do that, because if you asked me today, if I've never heard a National album and I want to get into them, where do I start? I would actually probably tell you Trouble Will Find Me. And I think that's for a couple of things. One, I think that this is the most accessible sound that they have. There's kind of a drastic moving away from how kind of noisy or anxious or cluttered their previous sounds were. This kind of brings back more of that ornate sound that Boxer had, but it feels, again, there's a spaciousness here that's on some songs, primarily like the one that comes to mind, at least, is one of my favorite songs on here, which is Fireproof, which is a song that you feel like you can feel the space on which these instruments were recorded as strongly as you feel the instruments themselves, where everything on here kind of has a bit of a muted sound, but in that mutedness you still feel like it's it's pressing into you. That the sort of production they have on here, it really does feel like an album that's sort of designed from the ground up to sort of capitalize on that groundswell of hype they had with High Violet. This is an album that's sort of the easy home run right after the setup. This is them just sort of taking a bit of a victory lap with their success in their scene. And I can understand why that could probably set some people at a distance with this record, why some people might not like, this is probably not what I would consider to be like a National fan's favorite National record, as I think this is sort of, in retrospect, seen as kind of a normie, as much as a beloved indie rock band record can be. That said, though, again, everything that was made, like that was done with the writing from Boxer to High Violet, is done here again. And if you paid attention to what I said in High Violet, then you'll know that that step forward for them was really important to me, because that's what made me get along with that record so much, was the sort of boldness and personalness of the writing that sort of abandoned some of their more earlier satirical elements. And here, this is just like the National sort of crystallizing this sort of principle, this direction, into each one of these songs. And it really does feel like an album that you can listen to without having the sort of baggage of knowing what the band and what Matt are trying to accomplish artistically. And you can just sort of enjoy this as your favorite sad boy indie record, which it sounds like I'm demeaning it, but I'm really not. I'm just saying that in many ways, it's the same reason I would recommend people who haven't heard a lot of Radiohead, that I would recommend In Rainbows to them, in that that's a very accessible, very consistently exciting record. Not that I would call this exciting. It's not particularly joyous, but there is sort of a instrumental verve here that I do think is, I guess, understated, but it's still very, it can be very full of sort of momentum when it wants to be. I mean, there are songs on here like I Should Live in Salt, I think, is one of those songs that beautifully progresses instrumentally, just sort of like builds and builds and builds. And it's not like a fast moving song, but it's a song that hits with a whole lot of impact. Like once you get to the sort of end there, one of my favorite sort of textural choices all across this album are the synths. It's because they distinctly sound like they're not electronic. I don't know how to sort of emphasize it, but they feel as organic as the rest of the instrumentation does. Like on Fireproof, there's these occasional sort of like synth swells that happen right after he'll say the sort of hook in the song, and they're very weird. They're very like sour feeling and strange, and that sort of feeling just sort of persists throughout the entire record of being very it's very sonically diverse, but the sort of approach to everything feels the same, and it gives it a kind of unity and simultaneous sort of versatility. So it makes you sort of capitalizes on all the different things that they can do that they've built up with their instrumental backbone over the years, but also don't do that into the point where it pushes to the extreme of being like an album that just has so many different sounds and so much different instrumentation that it feels like it's kind of throwing you for a loop. So this to me is like the point in the Nationals' career where they're doing the most delicate balancing act possible of all of the things that make them really broadly appealing, but all of the things too that make them really strong as significant artists. And they're sort of pulling from all of these different things to make the sort of like, if you made a web of records, to me, Trouble Will Find Me is the kind of center of that web. To me, this is the quintessential National album that I feel like I can draw the DNA from each of their other records from or into.
As I kind of detailed in the last episode, when I was getting into the National around like 2012-ish, that was just before this record came out. So this was the first record that came out while I was a National fan. And it's funny, the critical discourse at that time, because Boxer and High Violet were both these, massive pillars that represented these kind of like, twin sort of masterpieces in the critical view. And Trouble Will Find Me was very well received as well. Like it was definitely considered to be another great record, but it was kind of like, the first great record after their masterpieces, right? And it was kind of considered like the next, the first great record in their kind of like, middle era or like later era, or kind of like as luminaries. So it's kind of like, it was thought of at the time, it's a great record, but it was kind of like there's the ceiling to it where it was like, it could never be seen as one of these, as a kind of pillar like the previous two records were. And then over time, as I think this record is kind of aged, I feel like that perception has shifted, even among critical discussion of the Nationals, but of course also among fan discussion of the Nationals as well. Whereas this record has kind of been retroactively kind of canonized along with the two that precede it. And that kind of taking a little bit of time to do, which, forecasting in 2 weeks' time, that's also something that's very slowly happening with Sleep Well Beast as well. But that kind of gradual shift in people's view of this record, because at the time it was like, oh, it's a great record, yeah, but it's like the National are kind of paring it back and they're doing a quieter one, and they're kind of taking, they're deliberately not giving us their all with this, and that's kind of the appeal of it, yada yada yada. Whereas ever since then, the discourse has shifted to like, no, the National are giving us their all with this, but it's just a different mode, right? And so, and I think that that's a fair assessment, right? Because it is certainly, you could make the argument this is one of, if not their most influential records in a certain sense, because when you think about, this came out in 2013, and you think about the sound of indie now, and the sound of indie for the last like 5 years, maybe I would say, especially the sound of solo artists as well. Like there's a particular kind of like indie folk, indie rock sound that you can, like a very sort of atmospheric sound that you can, I think, directly trace back to this record. It's kind of come to pervade, I mean, it's an obvious example because we always fucking talk about her, but like Phoebe Bridgers, for example, and the sound palette of a record like Punisher, I think you can directly trace that to Trouble Will Find Me, which is why it's no surprise to me that they're both those records mean the world to you, Jake, like, because they're very kind of similar in terms of the, like the base DNA, essentially, that they're the base kind of foundation, let's just say, that the rest of the albums are built up from. And so like, absolutely. I think that, the increasing prevalence of a sound like this in indie rock is something that has contributed to this record kind of retroactively being acknowledged for what a powerhouse it is, but also for how important it is, not even just in the progression of the National, but even as in the progression of indie music as well. So that's an interesting wrinkle, I think.
When I was walking this morning and listening to it, I had a similar thought. Like, I bet Phoebe Bridgers has listened to this album a lot and really likes it.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, like, this is the last time, just how devastating that song is in the end. Like, just speaking to a specific moment in a song, just the way that ends, it actually reminds me of the first track on their second album, how when it shifts at the end, it sort of becomes like shocking just how devastating it is to Matt, the way he's able to capture like how lost he feels in that song. And this is the last time at the end, that shift where I guess you have Sharon Van Etten's vocals, who I did not know was featured on this record before, and whose voice sounds wonderful next to Matt's, like on the song they did for that one movie, Win together.
Yeah, Think You Can Wait.
Think You Can Wait. Yes. Oh my God, that song is beautiful. So it actually makes sense that this is the last time would be one of the ones that hits hardest for me. But like that last part where he says, baby, you gave me bad ideas, baby, you left me sad and high. And the atmosphere of it and everything, that one just tears at my heartstrings.
Mm. Yeah, the way that just curdles at the end as well, with the kind of like
Yeah.
slightly dissonant strings that are kind of like sort of being
Mhm.
bowed upwards a little bit. It's really kind of eerie. And it's like, yeah, the song, especially when you think about how that song begins, right? It's like this naked space, and you can hear, you know, this it's just such a beautiful sound, like that just gentle kind of like strumming, like, and it's just so, again, spacious. Like, this is the thing, like, this is such a soft sounding record, like even in its harder edged moments, you know, there's no real point where like you get guitar distortion that like kind of, you know, hits you in their face or whatever. It's all very kind of tasteful distortion, and a lot of the time there just isn't that much distortion at all. It's the kind of record that feels like, you know, if you push it too hard, it'll just break and shatter into a million pieces, right? And this is Last Time, which is kind of like a centerpiece song along with Graceless, is kind of like a great example of that, right? Because it's like, it's so fragile. It's so like, Matt's voice is just is so delicate. Like when he comes in, he's only sort of saying like one syllable at a time, and he's kind of just sort of like slowly intoning. And it does sort of build up as well. Brian comes in with the drums, kind of starting laying down a steady beat. But that's another thing as well. You know, I think a lot of people who value Brian as a drummer as their favorite part of the National, maybe, you know, don't spend as much time with this record because his drum parts aren't as, you know, high in the mix and they're not as impactful, but he's serving the song as he always does. But yeah, it just builds and builds and then kind of, you know, evaporates into this other thing. And I think it's great because, you know, to do my songwritery English student analysis thing, you know, the song is about drug addiction. It's the most explicit song on the record about drug addiction. And it simulates, you know, the rise of rush of a drug addiction, you know, the blankness at the start and then kind of gradually building and building and kind of, you know, this heavy sort of weight of the song kind of gradually building. And it's kind of like, you know, he starts walking and then it turns into running. And then you're basically like sprinting at the point where he's like, oh, I won't be waiting anymore, that part. And then like, you know, that's the peak of the high essentially. And then, you know, it's the come down in the last part of the song, the come down, the withdrawal in the final moments, right? That's the arc of the song musically, and it's like complementing what's going on lyrically as well, which is why, you know, it's that's how you make a great song, right? So yeah, that's a brilliant example. And then like that going into Graceless is so great as well, because at the start of that song, you know, he's talking about, is there a powder to erase this? So he's, you know, he's still in that kind of like strung out high and dry state, looking to find something that will make him feel complete again. And like Graceless, which is one of my favorite National songs incidentally, is like that's, to me, that's maybe one of the most kind of like, you know, the hugest moments on the record, where all of a sudden, like, because for most of the record, Matt's kind of pithy melancholy is kind of just sort of, you know, it's an abject disaffected state. It's not like something momentous or meaningful or huge, whereas Graceless is like the one song where he attempts to kind of like find something profound in the way that he feels like, and his sort of questioning of himself and of his self-loathing and of his self-doubt, right? And that's just such an electric moment that comes in at that perfect time on the record, that lets you just kind of have that rush, especially in that chorus as well. Again, nothing too flashy or, you know, overly wiggly or whatever going on with the guitar work here. It's very just even in tone, and it's like it's sanded down, but not in a way that makes it feel dull. But I guess that's what it does to some people, but in a way that just makes it feel like this sound has been like sculpted. And it's like it's a real kind of minimalist approach where nothing that doesn't need to be there is there. And, you know, in a lot of ways, when Jake, when you say it's like the quintessential National record and the one you recommend people start with, I definitely agree to a certain extent. And I think that, you know, depending on the person's already existing opinions of like indie rock and indie singer-songwriters and the kind of sound they look for. Because like when I think of, like when I imagine someone who doesn't like the National, who has this stereotyped idea of what they are. And like, you know, mopey, ridiculously self-indulgent, you know, yada, yada, yada. I imagine that what they hear in their head is this record or something like
Probably.
it, right? Like it's kind of like it leans into, I think, almost, which is another thing that's kind of a little bit daring about it, is they were starting to have a bit of a reputation as mopey indie rockers, and they kind of just lean into it full bore here. And it's kind of like, there's no trying to like buck that at all, like they do with Sleep Well Beast, which we'll get to. You know, it's like a seminal text. It is like the quintessential vision of this band in a certain sense, and what they've evolved into being. And so that, I think, makes it feel really important.
I always get the feeling that while listening to it, that Matt just had like this undercurrent of energy that he felt. Because I did read that like Aaron was sending him just bits and pieces of instrumentals he was coming up with, because he was so tired dealing with having a new kid, and he was just like making little parts of songs and not putting much thought into them. And that Matt was able to really connect with these, and he just like felt a rush of energy making these. And so during the album, it just feels like Matt just sort of just like let that energy exist as it is. He didn't try to put on any airs or try to appear a certain way. He just, like you said, leaning into the sad bar thing. This is how he feels, and he just let that out on the album.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I also think, you know, when we acknowledge that, there's also like one of the things that makes this a great record, that makes it really rewarding to listen to again and again and again, is that, like, you know, it's never as simple like as we make it sound. Like there's always something going on in the album that makes it a little bit more interesting than maybe your initial impression, or maybe like what you could communicate. Like, for instance, the first couple of songs on this record, they're both in really odd time signatures. Demons is in 7/8, so it ends like, you know, like a quarter note earlier than it should, and it has this that kind of unease to it. Demons also is a song that's grown on me as well. It's one of the most kind of monotone and sort of steadily, you know, single paced sort of songs. Matt's in a really kind of dour place, and he's singing in a way that's very sort of like really leaning into this lower end of his voice, which, you know, works thematically, because then you get to the hook of the song, which is like, I stay down with my demons, and his voice is like at the lowest possible way that he can sing, and it's very monotone. But like one of the things that I've really come to appreciate, and I've talked about this before as well, the National really know how to craft a great bridge, and they understand what a great bridge, why a great bridge is important, right? Because for the National, songs often start in a really sort of steady, straightforward, predictable place, and they are in kind of one key, usually one or two keys, and they're just sort of not really doing a lot that's musically changing, modifying, or doing very much. It's just kind of exploring a singular idea, you know, verse, chorus, verse, chorus. And usually with the National, the bridge is where the musical ideas of the song start to change and develop and build into something different. And oftentimes, as we've kind of talked about, following the bridge, the song can be something very different to what it was originally, or it can be something that's not hugely different, but it has changed, right? And I feel like Demons is a great example of that. It starts in this really kind of like somber, sort of steady, single, monotonous, you could say, place. And then with that bridge, which is just such a great bridge, and it ends with one of my favorite lines on the record: when I walk into a room, I do not light it up. Fuck. Which is just so well delivered. And then it's sort of, when the chorus comes back, and it has almost like, I don't know if the key's different, but it just has this kind of additional energy and surge to it. Then I Should Live in Salt, which I've already talked about, another one of my favorite songs on the record. Like that doesn't really have a bridge at all, I don't think, but it has this shift that happens towards the end. I think it has, I'm going to sound stupid if I'm wrong here, but I think that song has the only guitar solo on the record. I think it does. There might be another guitar solo somewhere that I'm forgetting.
Right.
But there's like, instead of a bridge, or instead of like a kind of what you would think of as a traditional point of change 3/4 of the way into the song, you have this guitar solo come in, and it's like, it's such a Bryce Dessner guitar solo, right? Because it's like he's really only playing one or two different notes, but he's like hammering the texture of them. He's like really just letting them ring out, and they feel huge, right? Especially when you've got the piano and everything else that's already been happening in the song kind of, you know, rising and rising and rising together. And it's like, you know, the song doesn't have a bridge necessarily, but it has that intrusion of the guitar solo that gives it this entirely new musical sense, essentially, or new musical identity, and makes those final chorus iterations feel like 10 times more powerful. And I love that. I love that kind of detail. It's just, it's the juice. It's so good. That's what I love about the National musically. is that, yeah, you listen to records and you love them and all that sort of thing, and then you listen to them and you start to see how they construct a song. And it's often really tasteful and really kind of like, nothing, they're not necessarily reinventing any rules of music or anything like that, but they know the language of how to make a song, and they know how to do it in a way that just feels just so satisfying.
I feel similarly about Heaven Faced. The way it starts off, it's so soft, and then when it gets to the final part, which is so incredibly emotional, that build up with just the drums, Brian's drumming, yeah, like you said, I don't hear this album talked about a lot in terms of its drumming, in terms of what Brian is doing, but I think it's fantastic across the board. I also, apparently a lot of people view the album as being like not their best sounding, like the mix or something like that. And I don't really have an ear for mixes, so I can't really speak to that. But I think it just sounds great across the board. On Heaven Face, when they're able to just like pick up the emotion for the end, which feels like all of that is coming from the drums to me, and from that Matt's repeated phrase, when he says like, "I'm a griever now, I believe her." That is just a very powerful moment to me.
Yeah, no, you're right. The drums are really effective in that moment. It's maybe one of the moments on the record where they're the most like, standing out. And I kind of get with regard to the mixing complaint, I don't think, again, there's like good mixing and bad mixing are kind of meaningless terms. You've got to kind of like describe it, I guess. And then you get into this weird nerdy territory. I think the thing about the mixing of this record, and it's a purposeful aesthetic decision. It's very kind of like even. And so there's not a lot of dynamics in the way that this record is mixed, which is not inherently a bad thing. But I mean, definitely compared to High Violet, well, actually High Violet doesn't have a huge amount of dynamics either, but it's just that everything's really loud. But if you
I was going to say, this is sort of the opposite of that in a lot of respects, two different ends of a polarity.
Yeah, whereas something like Sleep Well Beast is kind of like, I think there's more dynamic range in that record's mixes, but that's another conversation. But yeah, so it just kind of goes back to what we've already been saying about the sound of this record, how it is very sort of like soft, and the mixing complements that by kind of keeping everything sort of close together, but also like nothing is very loud. So maybe some people don't like enjoy that, but anyway, Jake, what are some of your favorite sort of songs on this record, and what are some of the things those songs do that really make you, feel it?
One of them is a song we have mentioned already, but Graceless is absolutely one of my favorite songs on here, and it's because the production style is so different that I don't think it like leapt out at me immediately. But like, this is basically the National doing like a soft cover of Joy Division's Disorder. Like, listen to the bass line and you'll just be like, oh shit.
Yeah, the bass line is similar, actually, now you say that.
And the sort of that sort of cycling drum beat too is even like it's the same thing, but it's so muted and kind of lower. It's not focused on being like noisier or aggressive, but like there's a very Unknown Pleasures-y kind of playing with atmospherics on this song, because there's like it's like a drony sounding synth in this fucking song, and it sounds like it just kind of sounds like strings being bowed like simultaneously, very like high and low, and it makes you feel kind of queasy. It's like this sound, and it's just like, it's very strange. It's the sound of like something like stretching, and it just gives this song a whole lot of like strange kind of impact. It's one of the more up-tempo songs on the record, and I get a lot of mileage out of it, and it's spectacular music video. We haven't mentioned a whole lot of music videos of this band just because they're not a super great music video band, but I love the music video for Graceless, and the one for I Need My Girl, I think, is that the one I'm thinking of? That one's pretty good too. I really do love Fireproof. That is maybe the most stripped back song on here. And again, it's sort of that song where I feel like it's one of those things where you feel the negative space of it the most on this record.
Interesting thing about Fireproof, just while you're on that, it was the only song on the record, I believe, that was recorded in a different location to the other songs. It was recorded in a recording studio that was a converted church, and it was recorded live. So it's, I think, the only song on the record that's recorded live. So like there is a particular, and again, the record is mixed very evenly, so you can't necessarily tell, but there is like a particular space in that song. And that I think does sort of become its chief characteristic. I mean, that's an interesting song, because like the biggest my favorite thing about it is like silence, and the way that silence and space
Yeah.
is used in that song. It's very like, you know, it's just a song that's barely there in some ways.
I want to say there's like a palpable sort of jealousy in this song that like your partner is able to go through certain experiences and have certain experiences that you either don't get through unfazed or that you just don't have at all, and you kind of like almost like living like vicariously through them. But there's also, again, it sort of lends a sort of dimensionality to it in the second verse where it says, you tell me you're waiting to find someone who isn't so hopeless and there's no one. It's like, God bless Matt. Can you give me a moment?
That
And
like
he
in
said
combination
no.
with the Elliott Smith reference, it's kind of like,
Right.
this is too much.
I also like how he sort of changes Fireproof from being about someone that he's sort of like envious of their like their emotional strength or like their stoicness. He changes that to being like a motivational thing for them. Like he's telling this person, you're fireproof, you're golden, you're gonna be okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a good
it's
point.
sort of like it's sort of self-effacing, but like it's almost like character development in a weird way, and that like he hasn't really improved, but he's using the fact that he hasn't improved to try and help somebody else. It's real fucking horizontal shit happening here. But that's again, this album is written from a very wizened, very mature perspective that does feel like an evolution of those earlier records, but with a sort of more even-tempered kind of, I don't want to say like, you know, we hate to use the word mature on here, but this is sort of a record that you make when you're really confident in yourself and when you've kind of broken through and when you have your musical identity. And I Need My Girl is just, you know, I feel like this is one of the National's most popular songs, and if it
I
isn't,
think it is one of the
probably
songs with
should
the
be.
most streams actually on Spotify.
It's
And I'm not
probably because it was used in very, very humorously at the season finale of the Netflix show You,
oh my
which is
God.
probably why it's there. But it's a very, very fan. I mean, like you almost, it's almost sort of like you would picture a National song title in your head, and you hear "I Need My Girl," and you're like, that's a bit fucking, it's a bit hammered on the head there a little too much, aren't you? But there's so many of those tangible details that we talk about from earlier records like Alligator that are in this song. To like remember when you lost your shit and drove the car into the garden, you got out and said I'm sorry to the vines and no one saw it. And it's like, again, all of these tiny little details, it feels like they're at their most effective. The sort of clarity of these songs and the atmosphere that their kind of loneliness has created. Like, again, it's a very inherently like lonelier sounding album that just makes all of these lyrically incisive moments hit that much more deeply. It's them creating a sound that allows everything else to sort of hit you, whereas like the music is, it feels like it's working perfectly like in tandem with the performances, like in a way that maybe like I feel is understandable as to why this wouldn't be someone's favorite National album. But to me, it's the fact that they work with such synergy together and maybe are less impressive when you isolate them. And that's, you know, sure, that's definitely true to a certain extent, but it's because of that synergy that I think that this song and pretty much the entire album is this like ridiculously effective to the, actually, it reminds me, even though I didn't listen to either of these albums in the years that they came out, but this does remind me of another album from another post-punk musician that I love, that we all love. It reminds me of Nick Cave's Push the Sky Away, an album that dropped that exact same year, which sort of does the opposite of this, where it's like its mixes are like very dense, but that's also a very like stark, kind of comparatively quiet album that just, it doesn't have as much negative space, but it focuses on isolation just as much as this does. And it feels like both of them hone a kind of stripped back sort of just like kind of, it's sort of claustrophobic when Nick does it, and I wouldn't say that it's claustrophobic here, but there is something about it that feels like it's off-putting or just kind of shoving the listener to the side. It's a very strange thing to try and describe, but you do sort of feel like you're almost in the album's way when you're listening to it.
The album cover, I think, might be a really great way of illustrating this feeling, which
Yes.
here it is on vinyl. A beautiful album cover, a really kind of stark and sort of haunting image. And I will say that it seems so stupid now, but for the longest time, I did think this was just Matt's head. Of course, it's not. It's just this is an art installation that they used a photo from, but whatever. But yeah,
It's like, damn, Matt, you've been using some great volume in your hair for shit.
I
Like,
know,
damn.
I was 16. Don't listen to me. But yeah, like
I probably would have thought the same shit.
we still haven't talked about some of my favorite songs on this record, and so I want to shout out probably this song. Yeah, this is no, it's not my favorite currently. God, what does that even matter? It's definitely the national song I've listened to the most. Well, it's either that or Sorrow. God, again, I'm really bad at keeping up with these things, but it feels like the national song I've listened to the most because it is, despite being one of the most lyrically dense songs on the record, it's also a song that I, in my senior year of high school, could recite on cue in full at any time if someone were to prompt me, which of course no one ever did, but that's just still something I could do. And that is the song Don't Swallow the Cap, which is
yes.
like, I think this song is, not only is this like 100 out of 100 perfect, it would also be 1,000 out of 1,000 perfect if I were to be that pernickety. This song is, God, it's just like I put it on and I completely just lose myself in it. I lose myself in completely. It's impossible for me to listen to this without singing along to it. That's how connected I am to the song now at this point. I love the, the kind of pace and tone with which Matt sings as well. It's like he's so locked in, and then the verses are just so like kind of bam, 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 bam. In the pre-chorus, everything I love is on the table. It's like you get a moment to breathe finally, and then the verses go back in. It's like, again, no moments to breathe. Bam, 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 bam. Pre-chorus again, and then that I'm not alone. God, the fucking key change that happens there is unreal, and the way this song, again, shout out Brian as well, because the drum and the pattern and everything about the song and the way that it sort of sustains itself is down to the rhythm section as well. Like, it's so insistent and so perfect. Yeah, and also just the cheeky offhand references as well to like other musical staples as well. Like, what's funny, Let It Be and Nevermind, is they did a Reddit AMA around the time this album came out, and it was like, one of the questions was, is Let It Be, are you talking about the Beatles album or the Replacements album? And Aaron immediately chimed in and said, oh, we're talking about the Beatles album. And then Matt was like, no, it's a Replacements reference. And like they couldn't agree on what album that was referencing. I think it makes slightly more sense to me as a Replacements reference, because both of those albums are kind of like from the same sort of era and sort of like alternative side of rock music. But yeah, that's just a really funny little detail. And like the song never really like changes. It's just one of those songs that kind of, it builds and builds and builds until you're kind of just sort of locked into place with it, and you're kind of just in sync with it, and your heart is beating alongside it. And it's just kind of, yeah, it does that thing that Trouble Will Find Me does a lot, where it's just the pace slowly amps up. Not to a point where it's kind of overwhelming, but just to a point where if you're walking at the start of the song, you're walking really fast, you're jogging at the end of the song. You're not running.
It really sounds like Painting of a Panic Attack, Frightened Rabbit again. This is one of those songs that I feel like you could just swap in the singers for it and it would be like nearly identical.
Another record produced by Aaron Dessner. And I believe specifically that the Frightened Rabbit hired him because they wanted to get a sound like this record on that album. So there you go.
And they did.
And they did, exactly. And it's like, if I listen to both this record and that record within a fucking 1 day proximity of each other, I need to be put on suicide watch.
I was about to say, I would call someone and be like, you need to go to New Zealand right now.
Yeah.
Like Matt's word choices, they just like roll off the tongue a lot of the time, even when it doesn't seem like he's saying anything like specific. And he said himself with Don't Swallow the Cap, that like that phrase itself, he doesn't really know what it means. I always used to think of it as like a nightcap or maybe even a pill because of the references to medication, but he doesn't know what it means. But that phrase itself just rolls off the tongue. Also in the song Graceless, I love this imagery here, but I also love the way the words sound. All of my thoughts of you, bullets through rotting fruit. So many times on the album, like not only is Matt just like on fire with his imagery and with his energy, but like the words he's picking just fit like puzzle pieces next to each other. I think that kind of adds to the I guess just the overall vibe of the record, where you can just kind of like sit back and just sink into all of it.
Yeah, 100%. Like it's not grabbing you and holding you tight, but it's like you're slowly kind of getting sucked in to the point where it's very difficult for me to turn this record off while it's on. Like not just because I like it a lot, but also just because I feel like it would feel wrong. Another song that exemplifies this that we haven't mentioned is another one of my top 5 on the record, which is Humiliation. Down in that final stretch of the record. This song is, well, first thing I'll say is, while I described this record earlier as very bright and summery, I will also say that this song needs to be listened to in the evening and you need to be driving. And like, if this song just makes you feel like immediately when it comes in with that steady beat and those piano chords that are just like so spacious, but also kind of like so melancholy, I immediately feel like I am like driving down a massive sort of motorway. And I'm just kind of like, it's the middle of the night and, you know, there's neon lights in the distance, all that sort of thing. And it's raining. And that's the vibe, right? And it's like, it's almost like a journey, this song. Like you're in motion the entire time. I love that. I love that feeling that it gives you. I could listen to it. I kind of wish it were like 5 minutes longer almost, because it's just so, it immerses you so much in this space again. And like Don't Swallow the Cap, you know, Matt is kind of like giving you line after line after line. It's a little bit more slower and measured in delivery, but it's kind of taking you through these series of images that really kind of evoke this, you know, this sense of unease, right? And I love as well, I didn't know this until today, but I looked up what Matt's kind of like inspiration was for this song. And it was like a dream he had where he was at a dinner party and he was kind of sitting by the pool and it was in the evening and he looked up and a drone strike was just coming down from the sky to kill them all. Like that was the impetus for this song essentially. And like the underlying idea there being like, you know, if you were to die right now, essentially, what would you be worth? You know, how would you feel about where you were at if you were to die right now, if you were to look up and see a bomb coming down from the sky? That's kind of what the song is about, right? It's about, you know, like reflecting on the sort of, you know, laissez-faire, careless way that you've lived your life and the kind of place that it's brought you to, right? So, and that's a feeling that, you know, again, gets really, really relatable, especially the older you get as well. You know, not that I'm that old, but like once you're in your mid-20s, it does that you do start to think about these kinds of things, you know, like what the fuck am I doing? And what the fuck have I done? And
you say that like we weren't like 17 listening to shit like Pink Rabbits and just being like, I feel you, man.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like just something about the line, if I die this instant, taken from the distance, they'll probably list it down among other things around town. Like that's just like, that line has been hitting really hard lately. Just this idea that like, you know, if you die, then your death and then you know, your life as a result of that will be like an interesting curio, you know, an obituary in a newspaper or like something that someone brings up when asked about something you were involved in, like as opposed to, you know, you just the realization and the knowledge that like, yeah, your death will like, you know, be impactful to the people closest to you, but it doesn't really mean anything on a broader scale. You know, that's something you process eventually. Sometimes very young and sometimes not so young. But yeah, it's like it's just one of those songs that it's a whole ass vibe in the most like depressing way possible.
I think it's one of the only National songs that has a motoric beat in it too. I can't think
Yeah,
of
that's
any
a
other.
good point. That's a great way of, yeah, it is a motoric beat, isn't it? So it's kind of like a bit, and that's kind of maybe what makes it feel so different for them as well, is that like it kind of feels a little bit, you know, sort of like proggy almost, but like in that kind of like 70s European prog sort of way. And then again, like you were saying about how these songs can change, this does the same thing as this is the last time we're in with that final outro with the She Wore Blue Velvet. You know, you have a total, you know, mood shift essentially. It's more kind of ambiguous and strange and kind of like, you know, the tones you can't quite pin down, but that's something that gives it a real appeal. I've seen listened to bootlegs as well. When they play this song live, sometimes like they turn the outro into this massive, like fiery, post-rock thing where like Matt is screaming. And it's like really funny how they transform this song. But yeah, I always feel like this song's really underrated. I don't often see people talking about it. And it's like, to me, it's definitely one of the most musically interesting on the whole album.
You know which one we haven't talked about is Sea of Love.
Yeah,
which I think was
yes.
That song is
what an
fucking
incredible
fantastic.
song. I love the video too, which apparently was they were paying homage to a Russian indie rock band's video, which has basically the exact same camera setup, even has like a little kid dancing in the front as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that song is incredible.
I love, like, to me, like one of the most indelible images of the National is Matt like kind of hollering into a microphone that's just suspended from a ceiling and not even like being held by anything, and just kind of like him reaching his head up and just yelling into it. Like that to me is like one of the most National images that I can think of. Like just this idea of this, middle-aged man, very well dressed, bearded, all that sort of thing, just kind of like screaming into a microphone suspended in the air. That to me is like, it's so them. And that is like a great song as well. One of the singles, it has, it's one of the loudest, most kind of fast-paced songs on the record. It has those, amazing, like kind of unplaceable kind of backing vocal shouts at the end that kind of remind me a little bit of Secret Meeting and the unplaceable backward vocals shouting at the end of that song. But yeah, it's a dope as hell song. I love that track.
I love when it slows down and they just get they say the title of the album. I say here, trouble will
just
find
like,
me.
Trouble will find
he said the thing. Anyway, yeah, so good. And that's funny because like, then you go into the kind of bit more of a slower part, and then you get like the bridge as well, which it's the outro. The song that is the bridge. And it's like another example of like, again, it's a small change in the song. It's a very, very like small bridge, but then it completely sets up when the outro comes in with, "Hey Joe, sorry," and then everything is just more intense, and the backing vocals are kind of doing the role of a guitar solo. Great shit. My favorite song on this album, actually, before I get into that, I just want to shout out real quick Slipped, which we also haven't talked about. I love this song. When I last went through a significant breakup before the one I'm currently going through, back in like early 2016, this album was one I listened to an awful lot, and this song was one I wallowed to all the time. Like this song is like one of the most perfect wallowing in your own fucking pathetic sadness songs that the National have ever written. Like especially when he's like, "I don't need any help to be breakable, believe me." It's like, dude, it's so self-indulgent. It's so like kind of just ridiculously kind of maudlin and mawkish, but like that's the appeal. Sometimes you need a fucking song that is as just relentlessly kind of just hopelessly self-loathing as Slipped is. Like, God, that song just wrecks me.
I love that line. I don't want you to grieve, but I want you to sympathize.
Yeah, shit, yeah. God, that's so real. That's so fucking real. And again, it's like one of those songs like Fireproof or like Heaven Face, where it's like it's so like barely there, or like I Need My Girl, for instance. It's so like kind of barely there. Like musically, it's very simplistic. For a lot of it, you don't have any drums until they kind of do come in a little bit.
It's super tasteful, which is a theme across the National discography. I feel like that like sort of peaked on Boxer. That album just feels like just taste personified or whatever. But Slipped. It also kind of has like a bit of a soulful thing going on. And I think this is like one of the first times where you get a sense of an influence of soul coming in. And that kind of reminds me of the fact that Matt's solo album from 2020, that it was produced by Booker T, which is like one of the most shocking collaborations I've ever seen. But when you hear a song like this, you can kind of like see how there's something there. There's an influence going on there.
Yeah, and shout out to that album, Serpentine Prison, as well. Very underrated, I think. A lot of, again, it's like Trouble Will Find Me, but like even more stripped back and sparse, but like everything is really in its right place on that album. All right, so the last two songs on this record. I guess if you know me very well, you probably already know that Pink Rabbits is my favorite song on this album, or I don't know, you might have guessed that. It is like, of the big, big sad ballad, ambling through the streets drunk national songs. We all know what they are. Pink Rabbits, I think, is the best one in the entire discography, or at least it's like the most perfect one to me. Like the moment those piano chords come in and they sound momentous, right? That progression they're doing is like one of those. God, Aaron is so good at coming up with like these piano progressions that instantly feel like they've existed for a million years, but you can't ever directly identify them anywhere else. Like it's just instant classic. Corinne at the Liquor Store on their next album has a very similar progression that's almost the same as this one, but just different enough to feel distinct. And and this song is just like Don't Swallow the Cap. I know every lyric on this thing. I sing along to every lyric when this thing is playing. Like you do not want to be in the car with me while this is playing unless you also are prepared to sing along to this, because otherwise it's just that's the rule, right? And yeah, I can't play this unless I'm really in a place, in a mood, in a mindset, in an actual location where I can just fucking go nuts, because this is one of those songs where I can't hold back. I'm sorry. It's just too much.
That second verse is just like, it's the perfect melody to be sung along to, and then you realize the lyrics that you're saying, and then you just get to, I didn't ask for this pain, it just came over me, and you're like,
he has this vocal
God.
melody, he has this vocal pattern as well, where like it's like an A-B thing, where the first line goes up, and then the B line goes, it goes down like that, and it's like a bipolar thing. Like you just kind of and from a line to line basis, you're just kind of veering from that high point to a low point, and that may be just one of the things that really makes it feel so like emotional, is just the whirlwind of it.
It also contains what I think is the second funniest Matt Berninger lyric ever, which is you can probably guess what it is.
Yeah.
You didn't see me, I was falling apart. I was a white girl in a crowd of white girls in the park.
That's just so good.
Also, the second Matt Berninger line in their whole discog, where he references a crowd or circle of girls of a specific race, that means something.
Yep.
That feels like a deliberate kind of callback as well to the all the wine line. It's like that song is kind of about like and what's interesting about that, if I'm gonna like pursue that, is like All the Wine is a song about like alcohol induced and sort of entitlement and an inflated ego and feeling like you're fucking untouchable, right? And this is like a song about and this is deliberately echoing that, but it's like being in the opposite space, right, where you're like at your lowest and you're thinking the lowest of yourself, to the point where in All the Wine everyone can see me, I am the motorcade left to go around me, all that sort of stuff. I am the biggest thing in town, right? Whereas here it's like I'm not even visible. I completely blend in. Like no one can even see me. It's the exact opposite of the mindset of All the Wine, which is my pet theory for why that's an illusion here. And like to the point where no one can see him, and he only cares about one particular person seeing him. And it's not even like seeing him in real life, but whether or not this person is like imagining him, while they're like kind of in their feigning chair, which is a great kind of like, arcane piece of like 50s furniture. Also, like, again, so much middle-aged kind of like white guy sort of reference points as well, down to referencing the early Morrissey compilation album Boner Drag being on the stereo, which is just, that's so Matt Berninger. He would listen to fucking Boner Drag and drink fucking tequila. That's
looking up the lyrics to this finally, and then finding out what Boner Drag was, and I was just like, I mean, I should have figured.
And then like, again, that kind of like delivery of that, now I only think about Los Angeles when the sound kicks out, and you have that kind of like, I don't know what it is, some kind of synthesized instrumentation kind of bleeds in, and it just kind of rises. And then you get this most like anthemic outro ever, like, you said it would be painless. And it's just like, bam, that is, again, we've had example after example of this across this album, like the perfect kind of note to end a song on, this kind of rising climactic point that isn't a million miles ahead of everything else in the record, but it's this new musical idea, new lyrical refrain, new thing that ends the song in this just perfect place that brings it all together. And then you get to Hard to Find, which is like, the National have a lot of great closers, so it's inevitable that some of their closers are going to be like underrated or just lower down in the rankings. So I want to give this song its due, because this is a beautiful fucking end to the album, and I hear no one ever talking about it. First of all, Jake, last week, I can't remember exactly what it was in reference to. I think we might have been talking about the song England in the last episode of this series. And you referenced how it kind of gave you Great Gatsby vibes. This kind of idea of someone in this sort of self-imposed isolation, but still sort of longingly looking out across the water to a symbol that represents something that is missing from his life.
It was Lemon World. That's what it was.
Lemon World, exactly. Okay. I feel like that particular reference point is evoked even more clearly and directly in the opening lines of this song.
Glowing
lights. See the glowing lights. I can see them every night, really not that far away. I could be there in the day. I wonder if you live there still. I kind of think you always will. If I tried, you'd probably be hard to find. That's actually, I'm going to have a bit of a hot take here. This is one of my favorite verses that Matt's ever written. It's so simple. It's so kind of like straightforward. And the sentiment on it is so just like bald-faced longing. Right? There's nothing is dressed up here. And I love the way he dresses up lyrics and uses abstraction and color and repetition and all that sort of stuff. But this is just like one of the most naked sentiments I feel like he's ever expressed. And obviously it's given a setting and a dramatization, all that sort of stuff. It feels like it's probably is an intentional Great Gatsby reference as well. I just love this as well. To me, it's like the most perfect distillation of that kind of casual, disaffected longing that you have for someone, and it's a very particular type of longing. You only have it for very particular people in very particular scenarios or relationships or whatever it is, where it's like, you're never actually going to seek this person out because it wouldn't be right. And it wouldn't, and even if you did, like, even if you could find them, the them you're looking for wouldn't be there, right? Like it would be someone else, right? What you are imagining, what you're envisioning, finding is something that doesn't exist anymore. And that's just, God, it's just too much, man. It's too much. And he kind of expounds on this more and more as the song goes on. He throws in a really, really funny Violent Femmes reference with the chorus. Obviously their famous song Kiss Off of their self-titled record, which we reviewed like 2 years ago. That's a deliberate reference there in the chorus. And that idea of like that as being a rebellious song, and Kiss Off being like a kind of like twee punk sort of vaguely queer twisting of piss off, right? And that being recontextualized here as a kind of like a kiss off being like a goodbye to your past, essentially, and a kind of embracing of, a future that may not be as bright for you. I don't know. I'm curious what the song, whether or not the song means anything, or if the song connects to either of you, or how you feel at the very least about it as an end to this record.
Personally, I've always found it to be like a slightly underwhelming ending, but it's sort of like there's some albums where everything that came before it was so perfect, and then just having like a kind of soft ending that leaves everything out, it doesn't take away from the album at all. And it's still beautifully written, like you were saying. And I didn't know that was a Violent Femmes reference, but I do love that the line that it closes out with, "You can all just kiss off into the air." It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I think the thing I like about it the most is just sort of that it is a very understated ending, but it's an understated ending to an understated record, and it just kind of drifts off, just kind of dissolves in the end there. It just sort of feels perfect. It's sort of the final act of isolation is just, Matt disappears, the instrumental slowly disappears, and then you're just kind of left with yourself and however you feel at the end of the experience. And it always feels so whole to me. Like whenever I'm finished with this is always an experience that leaves me wanting basically nothing else. And I would agree, this is kind of it's one of the I think it is the lowest rated song, tied with Slipped and Heaven Faced, which sure, rate your music, fine, whatever, do your thing. They're all great, but it's fine. But it did definitely take a while to grow on me. This was like the one song on there I was just like, oh yeah, hard to find. That's that's on that album. It's kind of goes in with the title, but it's a grower, but it is certainly one of my favorites on the album now.
Mm. It's a very small detail, but I do like how the title of the song is kind of like it kind of doesn't contradict, but it sort of like puts a twist on the title as well. Like, because the album title suggests like, you know, a certainty to your doom, basically. Whereas like this suggests almost like that, yeah, trouble will find me, but I'm hiding from that, or I'm escaping that, or I'm making myself as invisible as possible. Essentially, and that kind of ties in as well, that idea of like becoming invisible almost ties in with the way the song sort of is and sort of drifts around. Again, that central musical idea, that little sort of gently kind of plucked sort of twinkly little bit of acoustic guitar along with the piano. It's just so good. It's so, well, it's electric guitar, but it's played like very, very acoustically. God, I'm gonna piss someone off with that, but whatever. But yeah, and it's almost like not only does the song kind of drift off into ether, but also like it ends on a sour note as well. And that's something I really, really dig. I like when albums end with like a bum note, like an intentional one, where it's just like there's a slight bit of dissonance in the very last note of the song. And it's just kind of like you're hanging for a minute there. It's just, it really like, I think it inspires you to kind of like reflect and kind of bring you back to reality a little bit when the album's over. So I just love that as a detail. And there's also something about it that's kind of unsettling. So it kind of makes you want to just put the album on again so that you can kind of go back to something with a little bit more certainty and kind of just get that from your mind. I don't know. It's yeah, I think it's a great ending to the record. It's definitely not like one of my favorite National closers, but that's only because of the stiff competition. It is like the perfect closer for this album. I think no other song would make a better closer, I don't think.
You mentioned that you like when an album ends on a sour note. I was listening to a band that was hugely inspirational to the National early on, Silver Jews, last night.
Yeah.
Their album American Water. The
Yeah.
way the Wild Kindness ends with just that that one last like hit of the kick drum and a kind of dissonant note just leaves like this lasting kind of haunting feeling to it. Like, is he going to actually shine out in the wild kindness like he's saying in the song? Yeah, just something that came to mind.
Yeah. And also just like a recent reference point, because I've been listening to it a lot. The new Wild Pink album, I Love You So Much, which we're going to review in the weekend, has a lot of sort of moments like that where it's like you end on a moment of uncertainty, or sometimes a song will just kind of like stop, and it's really kind of disarming, and it has like a thematic and structural purpose and all that sort of stuff. But I just like those kinds of daring decisions that where the artist is like not afraid to sort of make the music feel imperfect, or kind of like make it feel even a little bit unsatisfying in a certain way if that serves a wider purpose that makes the art more fulfilling. And I think the National are good at doing that. All right, favorite tracks and ratings for Trouble Will Find Me by the National. Jake, why don't you go first?
All right. 3 favorite tracks. This is a tough one. These are songs that have been with me a whole long time. This is one of my favorite quintessential comfort albums. I'm gonna go with Fireproof, Graceless, and hard to find. Yeah, sure. That'll work. Least favorite. There is not one. All of these songs are incredible. This is a 10 out of 10. Personal canon, baby.
Well, hey, Morgan, who couldn't join us, his favorite tracks are Don't Swallow the Cap, This Is the Last Time, and Pink Rabbits. And Morgan, surprise, surprise, also gives it a 10. For me, my 3 favorite songs are Don't Swallow the Cap, Pink Rabbits, and my mind says Graceless, but my heart says Humiliation. So I'm going to put Humiliation in there for my third. Least favorite track, if I had to pick one, it would probably be Fireproof, but I like that song a lot, and I think we've talked about why it works really, really nicely. And I give this album an 8 out of 10.
And for me, my 3 favorite tracks are Sea of Love, This Is the Last Time, and Graceless. 3 tracks right in the middle. And that hurts leaving out I Need My Girl. That's painful, but I have to. And then if I have to pick a least favorite track, it would be the closer. Hard to find, but like I said, it works beautifully as a closer, so that's not really saying much. And the score I'd give it would be a 9.5 out of 10.
All right, which gives us an average rating overall of 9.4 for the National's Trouble Will Find Me. Anyway, let us know at home what you think of this album, where it fits in your national ranking, what you think of the song, what you think of the sound, what you think of our takes on the record as well. We want to hear from you in the comments below. We really like seeing your takes. We really like seeing what the records mean to you. So please keep giving us that feedback. If you enjoyed the video as well, consider giving it a like, subscribing if you haven't already. Of course, only if you enjoyed. Thank you again to our guest, Mika. Absolutely delightful to have Mika back to talk about the National as well. Just made sense. We couldn't not have Mika at some point in this series. And go and follow them on Twitter as well. All Twitter information will be in the description as well. And we'll be back again in 2 weeks' time with another guest to discuss Sleep Well Beast. As always, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Grey Goose, the world's best tasting vodka.